And now, we enter the era of Death Battle having a traditional seasonal format. And what a rough start we're off to. It's not a controversial opinion to say that Season 3 was quite the downgrade in quality compared to the previous season, and most people in the Versus community consider it to be the worst season of Death Battle. I personally believe it to be the second worst season, only beating out 4, but I still believe there were some real stinkers that came out of this one. However, there were also some gems that came out of it too, including some that I consider to be some of my all-time favorites to this day. Even still, considering that we only got 14 episodes this season, and a good amount of them aren't remembered fondly, that meant there were much less good episodes to counteract the ones that were below average. I want to bring up that it was around this time when Death Battle, back when they were known as Screw Attack, was beginning to merge with Rooster Teeth, which does explain why this season didn't clear the bar set before it by Season 2. Because of that, I like to think that the obvious growing pains present in this season were a necessary evil to ultimately raise the quality of the show overall in the later seasons. If this is your first exposure to Death Battle, then first of all, I would not start with Season 3, but if you so insist, then just know that I'll be spoiling the outcomes of every fight here. I'll have a playlist linked in the description so you can check these episodes out, and we can see if your thoughts mirror mine. If you are familiar with these episodes already, then just know that these are not ranked objectively worst to best, but rather my least favorite to favorite. With that out of the way, let's get started. When I said that we got some real stinkers out of Season 3, I meant it, and we're starting out with the absolute bottom of the barrel. I have no qualms admitting that Deadpool vs. Pinkie Pie is my least favorite episode in the entire show. Good God, this episode was such a train wreck, possibly on arrival too, since I hated the concept of it back when it was first announced, with the only thing these two have in common being fourth wall breaking. I'm of the opinion that a bad idea could be executed really well, and the series does prove that later on. That is not the case here. Being a gag episode, there is very obviously going to be gags played here. However, most of them felt forced. The Y7 rating that shows up in the middle of the fight is a great example of that, as well as pretty much all the fourth wall breaking that happens in the fight, save for Deadpool using the like-dislike bar as a lightsaber, which is admittedly pretty clever. Also, the fighting just stops out of nowhere when Deadpool realizes that Pinkie can break the fourth wall too, and the way it happens was just jarring to say the least. They also mess around with some of the episodes, which in theory could work, but the way it was done here just doesn't do it for me. It actually makes me cringe if I'm being honest. Look at how they massacred the animation of Batman vs. Captain America, by the way. No joke, I couldn't tell what part of the fight it was supposed to be when I first watched this episode. Turns out, it was supposed to be this part, and they didn't have access to Zack at that time so he could animate Deadpool and Pinkie messing with it, and got Luis to do it instead. Speaking of hijacking other episodes, why don't we talk about when they rated the podcast episode? Deadpool talking about how they did this fight on his birthday is one of my least favorite jokes in the entire series, as it was just so f***ing forced. And the way it ends, to be honest, I saw it coming from a mile away. It was gonna end in a draw, and they were gonna become friends. It was predictable to say the least, and I wouldn't mind it very much if it was executed well, but it was a far cry from what we ultimately got. So was there anything I liked in this episode? Well, yes actually. There's the like-dislike lightsaber I had already mentioned, but there's also the rigging of Deadpool's sprite in this scene looking pretty good. The voice acting from Takahata 101 and Brittany Lauda as Deadpool and Pinkie Pie respectively is pretty spot on, even if the latter dips into the annoying side a little bit, and Deadpool getting erased in the analysis was golden. Probably the only good thing about him showing up in the analysis, since he wasn't nearly as funny as he was in the last episode. Even the transition between sprites was non-existent here, especially if you look at his previous appearance. Legit though, this has to be the worst season finale in the series without question, and what I consider to be the worst episode in the series as a whole. And I'm not afraid to admit that I actually block it out of my mind whenever I can. Also, I'm pretty sure that is a watermark in the halftone effect used in this scene. There was a point in time where I almost put this at the bottom instead of Deadpool vs. Pinkie Pie, but then rewatching both episodes back to back reaffirmed how much I hated that one more. There's no denying how bad Mewtwo vs. Shadow is. Between the animation feeling like it had very little effort put into it and the fact that Shadow was represented like a joke, there's really nothing that keeps it from being bad. There are positives here though, like this scene as it's an homage to one of the better moments of Sonic 06, and I Am All of Mewtwo is a pretty kick-ass track. There's also the fact that Shadow dies by a spoon, but not before saying,
"Oh my god, I'm glowing! Why am I glowing?"
The rigging on Shadow here actually looks good, and Mewtwo sounded fine enough. And this is where we transition into the negatives, because Shadow sounds like ass. They reprised Taka from Shadow's previous episode where he fought Vegeta, and for what it was worth, he did a fine enough job there. In this episode, however, they wanted to make him sound bad on purpose to reference the voice acting in Sonic Adventure 2, and believe me, I'm gonna get back to how they mishandled Shadow in a bit. For now, let's talk about how bad the fight itself is. It's less than 2 minutes long for starters, and despite involving a Sonic character, it doesn't feel fast. At all. In fact, it feels a little slow, not to mention stilted, and there are times where the animation genuinely feels like it cuts corners, especially with Mewtwo reading Shadow's mind, where there are cutscenes taken straight out of Shadow the Hedgehog. Oh yeah, there's also a bona fide green screen in this fight, as the background wasn't even loaded in properly. Oh, you don't believe me? Here, look! This episode foretold that Shadow was gonna be a third-time returner and fight Ryuko from Kill la Kill! This isn't even impressive editing! I'm just using the green screen and putting something in its place! How the hell did that make it into the final cut?! I want to acknowledge that I know that Donimations, the animator for the episode, made this bad on purpose out of spite towards the team and left on bad terms. But the thing is, bad still means bad, and that isn't even the only spiteful thing about the episode. Let's talk about how they handled Shadow, because oh boy, it feels like they hopped aboard the Sonic hate train of unfair judgment that many influential content creators were on when making this episode. I already mentioned that Shadow's voice acting was intentionally awful, and I just want to ask, why? That's not something most people remember Shadow for, nor does it show respect. It just makes him into more of a joke than he actually is, for no good reason. The fact that he lost, regardless of whether it was legit or not, and the fact that Mewtwo got off completely scot-free, especially gives off the idea that they were biased against him, which is not something you should ever do with any character in a Versus series like this. Seriously, the backhanded comment calling Shadow the Hedgehog the worst game ever in the post-analysis shouldn't have been in the episode. If Deadpool vs. Pinkie Pie didn't exist, this would be my least favorite death battle episode. This was also presented at SGC for whatever reason, when either one of the episodes it was sandwiched between would have been a lot more fitting. But SGC just happened to line up with the 2D episode, and they absolutely 100% needed to make every other episode be 3D. Also, I'm not sure what to make of this hand-drawn shot of Mewtwo. It's kinda bad. You're probably thinking that I'm gonna call this another bad episode, seeing as the previous 2 segments were about my most hated episodes in the show's history. If I'm being honest, I don't feel that way for this one. Like I said in my Season 2 video, it takes a lot for me to consider an episode a bad one. Although I still feel that Cammy vs. Sonya is incredibly mediocre. What keeps me from calling this a bad episode is that the animation quality does start out pretty good in my eyes, and so does the action. Andronia is one of the more memorable jokes in the season, and stands out in an analysis that otherwise feels like it came straight out of Season 1 rather than almost 5 years ago. And that's just one of the problems present in this episode. The entire fight takes a dive in quality after Sonya throws Kano's corpse at Cammy, as everything lacked substance and honestly felt underwhelming. Yeah, nice attempt to hide that with the poor quality of the close-ups of Cammy you got going on. It feels like the fight overhyped itself with just one simple block there, and the close-up was just a pixelated PNG file of her, and it does not transition smoothly with her sprite at all. It doesn't help that it uses different shades of red and green than the sprite, and the PNG file depicts Cammy as dirty blonde, while her sprite depicts her as golden blonde. Things aren't much better for Sonya though, because what the hell is up with her sprite? I get that the Mortal Kombat sprites wouldn't mesh well with Street Fighters nowadays, and that they had to pixelate Sonya's more so it would mesh better with Cammy, but good god is it not pleasant to look at. At least her PNG file was more accurate than Cammy's. The ending also sucked. The drone just started spinning out of control, and we don't see the beginning of it happening between that and it shooting Cammy. We're just missing some frames in the animation, and without a good reason since the fight is only 2 minutes long. Also, there's hardly any impact from the explosion caused by it landing into the oil barrel in both sound design and visuals. And then there's the death. I could look past it taking a little long for Sonya to actually kill Cammy so it could feel more like a Mortal Kombat fatality, but I'm pretty sure Sonya ripped somebody in half by moving her legs horizontally rather than squeezing them so hard that they pop. Credit where it's due though, I like how much blood there is given how we have a Mortal Kombat character in the mix. And if there's anything in the post-analysis that I feel I should point out, it's that I'm not sure what to make of the fact that they use Test Your Might as their main argument for why Sonya is stronger, considering it's a minigame and that literally any Mortal Kombat character can do it. Although I've heard about it being canon to the Mortal Kombat lore, and that would make it a legit feat, so that's why I'm mixed on it. Then again, I don't care to rack my brain over it since there's really nothing in this episode that makes me want to care about anything in this debate, so whatever. Overall, this was the first death battle animation done by Luis, who is a great animator and definitely proves himself in later seasons, but this was not a good first impression, and I honestly think the DBX episodes he did before this were a lot better. Also, Sonya herself low-key spoiled the outcome of the episode before the fight graphic shows up. I don't have anything to add, it was just worth noting. I want to talk more on why I wasn't a fan of the fact that they had every 2 episodes be 3D, besides the fact that it screwed SGC out of getting an actually good episode. While I still liked them overall, as you'll see later down the line, it also stopped feeling like a special occurrence after a bit since we were getting them so often, and it started to feel like they were oversaturated. It was also a bad idea from a production standpoint, as every fight animation had to be completed within 6 weeks' time, and it started to take a toll on Torian while this episode was in production. Since it was too late to push it back, they ultimately had to change the script so it was less strenuous to animate so he wasn't as overworked, and yeah, let's just say I was worried that something like that was gonna happen. As someone who loved Torian's animations up to this point, Tracer vs. Scout was a disappointment. Even if you weren't aware of what was going on behind the scenes, you could probably tell that something was up because Scout doesn't do any running in the fight, and that's the thing he's known for doing. He runs at the start of the animation, sure, but not doing it in combat is out of character. There's only one moment in the fight itself where he's moving fast in any capacity, and it's brief. Hell, Tracer does more running in the fight and has far more moments where she's moving fast, albeit through her blink ability. I also feel like they should have included more of Scout's arsenal, in not just the fight, but in the analysis too. Even though I had placed my bets on Tracer to win the fight, it felt like only mentioning 7 of his weapons, some of which not even by name, could really give off the impression that he was nerfed, especially since he loses. Ultimately, the fight suffered from all those things, and it felt kinda boring to watch as a result, with a lack of any real standout moments. But what are the things I like in this episode? Well, the animation quality did still remain pretty good throughout, as well as the fact that the fight starts over Scout seeing that Tracer stole his team's briefcase, which is a nice little nod for TF2 fans to enjoy. The voice acting is also pretty good, with Elsie Lovelock sounding nearly identical to Cara Theobald when voicing Tracer. And Octopimp sounded great as Scout too, even if he sounded off at times, and he's certainly no Nathan Vetterlin. Fun fact, Nathan actually offered to voice the Scout in this episode when it was first announced, but by that point, all the voice work was already recorded and the episode was in post-production. Even still, with everything else, I just can't get into this fight. I would just watch Winglet's version in his Overwatch vs TF2 video. For the most part, it's what this fight should have been. This one was a little tricky to lock down the placement of, seeing as the parts I like here are better in quality than some of the episodes I have higher than this, but the parts I don't like are worse in quality than the episodes I deemed mediocre. Amy Rose vs Ramona Flowers was an overall mixed bag for me. It starts off pretty strong as it was really fast paced and was quite exciting to watch, not to mention the animation quality was good too. The locations also just look really colorful and it's quite pleasing to the eyes, especially the subspace. There's not any moments that really stick out to me, but I think it's just all of it blending in with each other and the fact that it culminated in 2 minutes that were really good, and I wish it had stayed that way. Otherwise, I could see myself calling this a good episode at least. I say that because after Ramona's clones start attacking Amy, everything begins to fall apart, and all the things I had just praised before then don't apply to the last minute or so. You know, for starters, I would have loved to see a longer fight between Amy and Ramona's clones, by the way, and I'd also like to know how exactly she defeated them. Though, based on the wind that's everywhere, it's probably the tornado, which I've always felt was oversold in the episode, and I hope I'm not the only one who thinks that. There's also some moments that are genuinely confusing as to what's supposed to be happening, like how that invisible line Amy just broke was supposed to be Ramona's hammer, when it was usually depicted to have a red handle. And, did Amy press her hammer on the purse so hard that it exploded? That's what I got from the animation, as I actually have no idea what it's supposed to be conveying exactly, especially with the sound design being genuinely awful. And then there's the death, which is massively bogged down by the fact that Amy takes way too long to actually send out the killing blow. All of 50 seconds, in fact, and most of it could have gone into the fight with the clones. But no, it was apparently more important to convey that Amy won the fight for almost a minute straight rather than have choreography that very likely would have made the fight better. There's also the fact that the animation quality was just as janky as it was at the end of the subspace segment, and it's pretty bothersome to watch. For example, the actual killing blow itself. From where Amy was standing in contrast to Ramona, she'd have to throw the arcade machine to the right of the map, but the animation has her throwing it to the left. But it was a direct hit and crushes her anyway? I'm sorry, but the only way that would make sense is if they had broken the 180 rule, and considering how jarring it was, there was no real benefit to doing it, and breaking the 180 rule isn't even something I take issue with most of the time, if at all. For as much as I railed on the episode just now, I don't think it was bad overall. Like I said, I really enjoyed the first 2 minutes of the fight, and I think it had some of the best 2D animation in the season, but the ending, however, had some of the absolute worst. And hell, I think it had the worst death of the season. Ultimately, I decided to take the middle ground and call it an okay episode since it has some great things going for it, bogged down by the fact that it also left a lot to be desired. And here we have one of the biggest stomps in death battle history. Oftentimes when they do these kinds of episodes, they take into account how the outcome will be obvious to a lot of people, so they at least try to make them entertaining stomps. Though as far as this one goes, I can't really say that I ever really enjoyed Flash vs. Quicksilver all that much. There's not anything that makes it inherently bad, but nothing too amazing either. What makes me so divided is the animation. There are parts of it that I think are pretty good, like the Speed Force section kicks quite a bit of ass, for example, especially with that speech at the beginning, and there's more that I'll discuss later. And then there's other parts where I have the opposite opinion, like how said Speed Force section ends in a pretty lacking death, what with Quicksilver hardly bleeding despite being impaled. There's also some very noticeable errors in the animation, like the sand going in the opposite direction from where Quicksilver is running, for example, and hell, everything that gets pulled into the tornado is missing sound effects, and it's pretty awkward to watch. There's also the fact that the animation doesn't really sell me on how fast these two are, and there are various times where it can actually feel pretty slow. I have a friend who hated this fight and said this to me after it came out, and I quote, "It was boring as f***," and I can see why he'd think that. This is a battle between speedsters, and I think it should have been riveting with some intense action from their high speeds, rather than whatever the hell we got in the final product. It's still way better than any sense of speed Mewtwo vs. Shadow tried to convey. Well, that is if it even attempted to do so in the first place, but I digress. As I stated earlier, there are parts in this fight that I did enjoy besides the Speed Force scene. There's the fact that the fight actually takes place in less than a second, what with the girl falling off a building at the beginning and was still in the air once it ended as seen in the aftermath. No, it's not actually that long in the video, it's just that time is slowed down so we can see these two duking it out from start to finish. As for voice acting, Edwin Tiong sounded great as Quicksilver, and Anthony Bowling as the Flash sounded fine for the most part. Although it was only for a cameo, Stuttering Craig sounded surprisingly good as Captain America, and I hope they cast him if they were to do another episode with the Star-Spangled Soldier. All in all, I wouldn't call this episode bad, but not good either. Just okay, really. So, Ken vs. Terry definitely exists. By all intents and purposes, it's an episode of Death Battle. Nothing more, nothing less. I have the least to talk about with this one in comparison to the rest of the episodes of the season. For things I like, there's a choice of characters in the background, albeit something only Street Fighter fans will notice and appreciate. There's also a few cool moments in the fight, like the two trading blows so hard, the dojo it takes place in starts to break, and kills Dan a second time. Ken using the Shinku Hadoken only for Terry to break through it with a Hagyoku Seiken charged power geyser is also up there. The analysis had some good jokes too, like how it started the running gag with Wiz and Boomstick confusing each other with the terminology for geese. Yeah, how many gooses make a geese, I wonder? Okay, back to the fight. It has its standout moments, and it does have a good pace, though there are problems for sure. It reuses a track that was literally used 7 episodes ago for starters, and it's also pretty short, only being 2 minutes long. Not to mention the death was sort of abrupt. And finally, outside of the things I had praised, there's not a whole lot in the rest of the animation that really sticks out to me in any way, whether it's positive or negative. It's just another episode of Death Battle, albeit a decent one overall, but not something I'm gonna go out of my way to watch again. I can just see all the eyebrows raising in the audience just from the fact that I put Bowser vs. Ganon in the upper half of the list. But I definitely agree that it should have been called Bowser vs. Ganondorf, so I'm gonna haphazardly put that in the official title. Anyway, is it a step down in quality from the 2D episodes from Season 2? Oh, absolutely, but that can honestly be said about all the other sprite fights in the season. Well, except one if you've been keeping track, though as far as this one goes, it wasn't too much of a drop in quality that I couldn't enjoy it. Hell, I've always thought it was pretty good. Now is this episode inaccurate? Well, if you asked me that question back when it first aired, I likely would have said no, if only because I bought the no limits fallacy they gave to Ganondorf, but nowadays, I'm thinking yes, it did have the wrong result. However, just because an episode is wrong doesn't mean I can't get enjoyment out of it. Hell, I still think the death is cool and interesting with Ganon cursing Bowser from the inside and blasting him apart, also from within. Yeah, hey Bowser, maybe try making sure your opponent is dead before voring them? Just saying. Okay, back on topic, the fight. It's a pretty fun watch throughout, and it has a good pacing to it, not to mention both original tracks were really freaking good. A lot of people seem to really like Blood on Broken Glass, and I do too, but I'm personally a sucker for Olympus Mons. It's my second favorite original track from Season 3, and while it's no EXO, it's still a pretty awesome tune. Brandon Yates is just really good at making bangers, I swear to God. The 2 hand-drawn parts of Ganondorf actually look really good, and both of them transition seamlessly with a custom sprite that's pretty well made. It's not made by anyone on the team, but still, whoever found it has some good taste. Also, the moment where Bowser gets his eye stabbed out, I will never forget the reactions most of my friends had to that scene when we watched this episode. There's also a reference to both franchises culminating at the tennis court, which is what makes that part of the fight really enjoyable to watch. Ganondorf has a thing where most of his boss fights involve hitting a light projectile back at him repeatedly, and that's what's happening here, while Bowser gets to play tennis as a reference to the Mario Tennis games. Of all the things to reference, sure, why not? There's a JoJo reference earlier in the fight, so whatever. Honestly, I don't have any real problems with the episode besides my disagreeing with the verdict. Yeah, the animation gets a little on the janky side at times, and the sprite for Ganon being meant to be seen from a top-down perspective doesn't mesh well with the environment. None of those issues really bothered me much at all. The episode as a whole isn't great, but I see it as a fun way to kill 15 minutes should I choose to rewatch it. These next few episodes, however, have achieved greatness. We all know at this point that Death Battle is a show that thrives on doing crossovers between 2 different franchises, although very rarely will they ever do a same series matchup. So what if they were to do that with Red vs. Blue, but also do an official crossover with the show themselves? Well, you get Meta vs. Carolina. Right off the bat, this episode was going to be something different, right down to how it starts, since it's also a Red vs. Blue episode. Instead of the normal introduction, we see Griffin Simmons chatting in Blood Gulch. We also get our very first instance of the analysis cutting to seeing Wiz and Boomstick, sort of a precursor to when it would become a regular thing 2 years later. These also function as a way for them to interact with the few RVB cast members that are in this episode, and Griff being Boomstick's guinea pig is way funnier than it should be. Good lord, maybe I should start watching Red vs. Blue if the humor in this episode is this good. Now, back to the fight at hand. The whole thing is very well choreographed, and there's some awesome action to go along with it, with a bunch of moments I really like. Special credit goes to Meta using the temporal distortion, keeping me on the edge of my seat, and everything afterwards being pure awesome. Well, except for the death being kinda generic, but that's me nitpicking here. It goes without saying that the voice acting for every character was fantastic, given that they were working directly with Rooster Teeth, so everyone involved got to reprise their roles. Note that the merger was still in the process of happening, by the way. While there wasn't any banter between the two combatants since Meta can only speak in grunts, there was Carolina and Church butting heads at points throughout the fight, and it was fun to listen to. However, there's also some conveyance that they rely on each other and are a capable team, which showcases a key difference between them and the Meta and all his 8 AIs that turned his head into an unintelligible mess. I won't be writing an essay on it, but it's still something to appreciate nonetheless. And then there's the music. It's an original track composed for the episode called Slingshot, and it's a bop. Easily my favorite original track from Season 3. Come to think of it, EXO might have tight competition for my favorite track from the first 4 seasons now. If there's one thing that bothers me, I hope I'm not the only person bothered by the fact that both combatants are on the wrong screens before the fight. I know it's a nitpick, but let's just say my OCD is screaming internally right now. Either way, it's a great episode I feel gets slept on for being a same series matchup from another Rooster Teeth property. If you want to give it a chance, maybe you'll find some enjoyment out of it. I certainly did. It's not any higher for the simple reason that I enjoy the next 5 episodes more. What if I told you that this was my dream matchup when I first got into Death Battle? Well, yes, it was very highly requested. Although Ratchet & Clank vs. Jak and Daxter wasn't the amazing fight I wanted it to be, it was still good enough to satisfy, and watching it again for this list, it's fantastic. And hold on a minute, isn't that the music used in the Ken vs. Terry segment? Right, that fight used it when it hadn't even been a year since this episode had come out yet. Well, at least there's another track that I'm sure more people remember this fight for anyway, so let's use that. So anyway, what do I like about this fight? It's pretty chaotic from start to finish, and fast-paced too. Not to mention both sides are using a good amount of their arsenals, using many different weapons, leaving you wondering what they're gonna use next. I can tell you as a Ratchet & Clank fan that they haven't used anywhere near the majority of Ratchet's weapons in the fight, but holy shit, there's a lot of games in that franchise, all with a large variety of different weapons, so using all of them would be way too much to ask, and what was used here was fine. It made the fight awesome, coupled with some great animation quality, and that's all I really care about. And you want to talk chaotic? How about the time where the Rhino 5 gets dropped out of Ratchet's hands and starts shooting on its own and goes crazy? I don't think it should be able to do that, but whatever adds to the craziness of the fight, I suppose. Plus, I'm just happy that the super weapon from my favorite Ratchet & Clank game was used. My only real problem with it is the sound design being kinda quiet during that segment, save for the characters' voices. It could be one of the reasons why I didn't like the death at first, and it's definitely one of the reasons why I'm still a little mixed on it now. Although I do like how it was an ode to someone who was on the research team at the time, who you may know as Max a few trades, as the weapon used, the liquid nitrogen gun, was his favorite weapon in the series. As for the overall dialogue, it's great, feeling like things all 4 characters would actually say. Here's my favorite part of it.
Mercy? No.
Chuckles every time, man, and one of the highlights of the voice acting in the fight, which was otherwise meh. I think the only character that sounded fine consistently was Jak, as I think Matt Shipman fit very well into the role. Ratchet and Clank both sounded off, as hearing them in this fight and hearing them in their games back to back is like night and day. Although, to be fair to Daniel J. Edwards, he was voicing a James Arnold Taylor character, and his voice isn't easy to replicate, but he gets good deliveries here and there in spite of that. And Joshua Tomar as Clank? Well, his laugh was pretty spot on. And finally, as much as I really don't want to have to insult the work of Todd Haberkorn, given that I really like him as a voice actor, plus we share a first name, his Daxter was just not good. Hell, it actually borders on bad, and is probably the worst voice acting I've ever heard from him, as he just does not sound right at all. At least this is the one time I can say that he wasn't great, as he's done fantastically both in and out of the show. Overall, this was an awesome episode that I'll happily come back to every now and then. There are problems, but I'll gladly overlook them if the good outweighs them this much. We've had a good amount of anime characters in the series, and it's still a regular thing now. But up until this point, however, we had yet to see an episode featuring anime characters fighting each other. Funny how this happened literally the year I started getting into anime, and one of the characters was from Fairy Tail, which was my first anime. And let's just say that Zora vs. Urza was a great introduction to anime versus anime fights in the series, as it was awesome. There is a big bad though, and it's the fact that it's less than 3 minutes long. But here's the thing, They were able to put so much into this 2-minute long fight, and the fact that it's all really good, it actually doesn't feel like it's that short. The main reason why I criticize other fights for being short is because they generally didn't clear the average bar for different reasons, and if they were a minute longer at least, then perhaps those flaws would have been fixed overall. Even other fights I like that are 2 minutes long only go as high as the good category, solely because it doesn't feel like there's that much to them that can really justify a better ranking. This fight is an exception, and yeah, I do feel like it could have benefited from being longer, but that's just really how I feel about any fight that's at that length regardless of quality. So anyway, what's so great about this fight? It's fast-paced and fun to watch throughout, and the sprite work on Urza's different armor sets are genuinely very well done. It's very fun seeing her switching through them at a good pace, and it adds some variety to the fight so it doesn't get stale, and all of it is benefited from some great animation quality. The voice acting is great too, with Keiji Tang doing a fantastic job voicing Zoro, even if he doesn't sound exactly like Chris Sabat. And Caitlin Barr sounding like a genuine voice double for Colleen Klinkenbeard while voicing Urza. She knocked it out of the park with this performance. As for the death, hot damn, is it just really good. It's a one-stroke duel that, while it is the finisher, felt very impactful, with even the top of a mountain getting sliced clean off. And the gore on Urza's corpse is very well detailed, but really, credit goes to the sound design in just that one slice. One of the best deaths in the season, and maybe even the series as a whole. So yeah, this dominated best 2D episode of Season 3, and it wasn't even close. The sprite episodes were definitely a weaker aspect of the season, but it's reassuring seeing one of them soaring this high above the average mark. Episode 69, a concept so powerful, it caused problems for the render farm. Hulk vs. Doomsday is just incredible to watch, even now. The intensity is ramped up to 11 with all the destruction that happens in the fight. Some negatives I want to get out of the way first is that the animation on Hulk's movements at the beginning did go straight into the uncanny valley for me, not to mention I'm not big on his model in general, though it is balanced out by how good Doomsday looked. I'm also not a fan of this particular effect here, as it looked like a placeholder than anything. Even still, those are just minor issues in what I consider to be an otherwise amazing fight. The destruction that happens in the city just as a byproduct of the two fighting even feels impactful, and coupled with the action, it genuinely feels like a battle between an unstoppable force and an immovable object, and I love it! Can I just point out how awesome it is seeing Hulk using the two halves of a police car as boxing gloves? It even completely shatters later just from the sheer might of these two. And also, God, I just love how every time something destructive happens on top of them, we go right back to seeing them fighting after a few seconds pass, like they're completely unaffected, and I'd buy it too. Even the music just feels like the perfect backing tracks for this fight, adding to the overall intensity. As for voice acting, Parker Bohan did amazingly as Hulk with every line, and while Doomsday is just voice clips taken from other sources, they work really well. And then there's the final minute of the fight or so, where Hulk comes back and becomes Worldbreaker Hulk. Their first clash after that happens leveled the whole f***ing city and expanded throughout the whole continent, and they don't even care. They're just more hell-bent on killing each other than anything. And how the fight ended was great too. Doomsday stabs Hulk repeatedly and punches him in the face over and over again, with blood hitting the camera and everything, and before ripping his head off, he stares Hulk dead in the eyes and makes sure the last thing he ever hears is his name. This was the first time a villain character won against a good guy character on the show, something that would only happen one other time as of uploading this video, and good lord was seeing Doomsday's victory for the first time shocking in that aspect, and in the best way possible. And with an ending like that, holy shit, I think we have another top-tier death on our hands, back to back with another. God damn, what else can I say other than that this episode was phenomenal. Honestly, I think I like it more now than I have when it first came out. There are just 2 more episodes I think were greater gems, though. Do I start this segment off with a society joke, or talk about how this fight was how I got clowned for the first time? Ah, forget it. Joker vs. Sweet Tooth was one of my favorite episodes in the series when it first came out, and it still is now. It's probably the most cinematic feeling episode of the season. The jokes and the analysis always gave me a good chuckle, and the animation? F***ing incredible. The car chase at the beginning is so goddamn exhilarating, with both characters driving at super fast speeds while also firing weapons at each other, ignoring all sorts of driving safety precautions in the process. And all the while, both characters are being a lot of fun to listen to, especially the Joker. I love the dialogue in this fight, as it sounds like things these two would actually say, even if much of Joker's lines were taken straight out of The Dark Knight. And it also showcases the clear differences between their personalities, and the voice acting from Lucas Schuneman and Gianni Matragrano as the Joker and Needles respectively was phenomenal. Now, what I mainly love about the fight is the atmosphere, as it transitions slowly from something more exciting that's more akin to Twisted Metal, to something more foreboding to more so fit the vibes the Joker gives off, and every track used here helps in that aspect so much. None of it is anything I'd listen to on its own, but goddamn did it help this fight feel so cinematic, and I love it. There's also the fact that there isn't a whole lot of fighting going on after the Joker mobile crashes, which sounds like a negative, but it isn't. In fact, it makes this fight different from all the other fights in the series in the best way possible. It's mainly Joker being Joker. How is that not entertaining? Hell, I like how Needles just gets fed up with his shit and wants him dead more and more as the fight progresses. And I love how Joker takes advantage of his one-track mind as a serial killer and uses it against him at the end of the fight, while also being disturbingly expressive in the process. God damn. All of it keeps me at the edge of my seat, even despite knowing what happens already and even who wins at the end. Speaking of characters winning, let's talk about how the Joker pulls off his against Sweet Tooth. It's pretty simple, with the use of the Joker Venom, but the scenery that comes afterwards from Needles laughing helplessly while also getting hallucinations of Joker and eventually suffocating and dying? It's one of the most chilling moments in the series and was so goddamn surreal to watch when I first saw the episode. It's another top tier death for me. My only problem is just that there's a bit of jank in the animation, but that's it. It's amazing how this was in my overall top 10 when it first came out, but then other fights happened and bumped it out, but it's still one of my all-time favorites. Getting clowned was so worth it. It's only number 2 because, well, there was only one episode I could reasonably put at the top of my list. After revisiting these episodes, I can definitively say that Season 3 overall was a mixed bag, seeing as I could only call half the episodes in it good. Compare it to Season 2, which had more than double the episodes here, but not only that, I could call 78% of them good, and the one episode I thought was bad wasn't as much of a low point as the bad episodes of this season, which are my 2 most hated episodes in the entire show if you recall. As a matter of fact, I think this season as a whole is worse than Season 1 because while it is objectively worse, at least that has the advantage of being the very first season of Death Battle, and without it, we wouldn't have the show we all know and love. When this season came around, we had already gotten some of the all-time greats both in 3D and 2D, so half the season being below average lacks an excuse in that regard. However, when looking at the good episodes here, while not all of them achieved greatness, a good majority of them did, and some of them are my all-time favorites of the show. And hell, the 3 episodes I just talked about all have in common that they have some of the best deaths in the entire series in my eyes. With all that said, it was pretty clear cut from the beginning on which episode was gonna be number 1. It set a bar so high as the premiere, the rest of the season wasn't able to surpass it, which was disappointing in hindsight, but looking at it objectively, it's the most perfect opening a Death Battle season can have, as it's my second favorite episode overall. There's no other episode I can call best episode of Season 3 other than this one. It was love at first sight when I first saw Dante vs. Bayonetta. The whole thing was godlike, as it had some of the best animation quality and action the series had to offer. I was thinking about how amazing the rest of Season 3 could be if the opener was this good, maybe even surpassing Season 2. But given how we're at number 1, I think we all know how that went, so let's not dwell on it any further. Firstly, I want to talk about how this is one of only 2 episodes in this series, the other being Ratchet & Clank vs. Jak and Daxter, to be in 60 frames per second, and I wish that was a thing that stuck around. Think about how amazing the analyses would look if it stayed like that, just as this one did, and it wouldn't come at the cost of any humor as the jokes here were funny as hell to me. As for the animation, while it isn't 60 FPS, it doesn't need to be, and I don't think I'd have it any other way. So you've probably noticed in the footage that both combatants are using a good variety of their weapons and abilities in the fight, and you'd be correct in guessing that I view it as a positive, with Dante using Quicksilver to counteract Bayonetta's Witch Time being my favorite example of it. I like it for the same reasons I would any other episode that did this. Adds variety, leaves you wondering what they're gonna do next, yada yada yada. And all this goes on for 6 whole minutes and never gets stale. This also helps the action get very over the top consistently, and it gets even more so when the fight gets taken to the falling clock, and oh wait, I skipped right past the segment in between. So Trish and Jean show up completely out of left field to assist Dante and Bayonetta respectively, which would have been a negative, but seeing how it made the fight that much better, and it having no bearing on the result at the end, it escapes being a con and actually ends up as a pro. It was added because Torian thought it would be cool, and he was right. It ended up feeling more like a passion project as a result, and was a nice way to advertise for DBX when that was still upcoming. A sideshow that, well, it has its ups and downs to say the least. Something else I can gush about because this fight just has so much, I swear, is that there's plenty of references to both franchises, some of which I didn't get when this first came out, but after having played Bayonetta 1 and Devil May Cry 4 a few years later, and then going back to this fight, there's just so much more that I can appreciate now that I know what most of the references are. Hell, the music used in the death was the exact same one from the cutscene where Dante first obtains Lucifer. It's also just a great death in general, as it's pretty brutal and over the top, and the fake out beforehand was also great. Phenomenal way to end the fight, and I just love how Dante cares so little about the fact that he got stabbed that he just leaves the sword in his chest for the rest of the animation, and even into the aftermath. Anyway, throughout the fight, there's some fun banter between the two combatants, and there's some stuff with Trish and Jean too. It's all helped greatly with the voice acting overall being fantastic. Stephen Fu and Marissa Lenti were spot on as Dante and Bayonetta respectively, and Morgan Berry and Dalton Bennett sounded pretty good as Trish and Jean respectively in their brief appearances also. As far as negatives go, there's some hiccups in the animation, but none of it really bothers me. But there is the fact that the raindrop feat was mentioned exclusively in the post-analysis when it wasn't in Dante's rundown when it should have been, especially if it was going to be the main argument as to why he's faster, and how it was a key reason as to why he won. This episode isn't perfect, but no death battle episode is, though let it not be said that this isn't an absolute masterpiece. There are times where I've asked myself why I didn't consider this my all-time favorite episode before, but I just happen to have stronger feelings for Wolverine vs. Raiden as my all-time favorite when rewatching that and this back-to-back, which is why I called that one my favorite. Even still, with how much I can gush about this fight and could continue to do so had this segment not been long enough already, I can very confidently call this my favorite episode of Season 3. And that's all for this list. I'm sorry it took me an entire month to get this one out. The Season 2 video and all its segments took a lot out of me, and I had some real-life things going on too, which prevented me from working on this more consistently. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed, and thank you for making it this far, and I'd like to know what your opinions are on these episodes in the comments. And at some point, I'll be doing this again, but with Season 4. Until then,